turn off your camera during the duration of the webinar, and also let us know. Your privacy is important to us and we respect your preferences. Additionally, we ask that participants keep their microphones muted throughout the presentation to minimise background noise. You'll have the opportunity to unmute yourselves during the Q&A session to ask any questions and engage with our speaker. Any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to pop them into the chat feature or share your thoughts. And Avni will manage the Q&A session after the presenter has completed his presentation. Look, let's make a start now. We're really excited to have you all here today. I'd like to formally introduce you to Ed Browne, the Principal Lawyer Commercial at Macpherson Kelley. With over 30 years experience in both Australia and South Africa, Ed is a seasoned expert in commercial law. He grew up in an extended family of lawyers, so no surprise that he has a passion for the law and also business, and that was ignited by observing and being involved in the family practice from an early age. And we were just talking about some of Ed's clients and the economic state and comparing notes before everyone came into the session. As commercial law is future-focused, Ed's skill is in both analysing current situations faced by clients and considering opportunities and issues that may arise as things evolve, making him a go-to advisor for businesses seeking growth and success. Ed has helped clients in a wide array of industries, ranging from IT, financial services and hospitality to construction and manufacturing. And Ed also has specific industry knowledge in the sectors of aged care and the caravan industry, both parks and manufacturing, which we were discussing before. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Ed Browne. Over to you, Ed.
Thanks very much, Chris, and I hope I'm coming through loud and clear to everyone, and a warm welcome to you. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work, and we recognise their strength and pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging. So today, I thought I would focus on essentially two aspects of businesses, both closely held businesses and family-owned businesses. And I thought we'd start by just giving a bit of an overview of I guess, private businesses in Australia. They're a very significant contributor to the Australian economy. About $600 billion is what the texts will tell you, that the contribution of privately owned businesses to the Australian economy. So it's a very significant contributor. It employs over 3 million people. So if you think about the major employers, it's the listed groups, not-for-profits, government, and then family and private businesses. So a very significant employer of people, and obviously a very important part of the Australian economy. From an Australian perspective, we're quite different to our international peers. And it's really, I guess, just a question of timing. Obviously, other countries have been around much longer than us Europeans. The family businesses there are sort of seventh, eighth generation. Australian businesses, first generation owners, is a much higher percentage than the global peer group. So 51% of the businesses are owned by first generation business owners. So a very young cohort when it comes to business ownership. The number of businesses where only one generation has been present is 75%. So as you can see, almost 3/4 of the businesses are first generation owned businesses. Of those businesses, about 2/3 of them plan to do one of two things: either sell their business or pass it on to the next generation. So there's a third of businesses who haven't quite worked out what they're going to do yet, and that obviously is a bit of a concern and a bit of an issue. And the modelling suggests that in the next 5 years, about 350,000 privately owned and family businesses will come to the market, or will change leadership, or there'll be some sort of transition. So that's a very significant number of businesses. And I think it's important to bring that up because if you're looking at going to sell your business, it's going to be a crowded market. And when you're in a crowded market, supply is greater than demand, and that pushes prices down. So, price expectations might need to be tempered if you're thinking of taking your business to the market when you're going into a very crowded market. What does that mean for private businesses? Well, it means time is of the essence, and time is running out, and it can run out pretty quickly on you if you're not prepared and well prepared. So I might just go to the next slide, Barney. So I thought the other thing that might be useful is to look at typical stakeholders in a privately owned business context. So if we sort of run a clockwise around the circle, in the top circle, you're talking about the concept of ownership and governance. So who owns and who governs the operation of the business. In the circle bottom right, it's family. So who's in that family circle? And the third circle bottom left is the business itself. And I think it's just helpful to have this in context because you can start to see who might be involved in conversations and deliberations when you're coming to deal with a transition of a family business. So number one, so we're talking at the top, number one, these are people who are involved in the ownership of the business, but who are not family members and not involved in the conduct of the business. So in that top space, and that probably in a context is really perhaps a listed company. So you might think of a listed company has got lots of shareholders. They're not family members and they're not involved in the ownership of the business. So in this context, perhaps not the most important cohort, although they sometimes have a role to play. You might have a silent investor, someone who's provided some equity into the business, but who's not involved, doesn't sit on the board, is just happy to have invested and not a family member. So there will be some instances in family businesses where you have that. The next is number two, that is family members, but they have no ownership interest in the business and don't work in the business. But you can think about a family where perhaps, dad and daughter work in the business, son is not in the business, but is part of the family and the business generates wealth, and that son is expecting to generate or receive some of the benefit because dad is an owner in the business. So he's expecting at some point in time to get a benefit from that business. Then three is people who work in the business, aren't owners, aren't family members. Essentially, we're talking about employees. Have a voice in what's going on, but essentially are not involved in this transitional piece, save to an extent that managers who don't own might fall into that, and they again might be someone that you're talking to in this transition piece. Number four, people who are in the business as perhaps directors and in the family, but are not employed in the business per se. They don't work and get paid a wage for effort. So they may have some shareholding and maybe not a director, have a shareholding. Perhaps there's an estate that has got some shares in the business, part of the family, but not involved in the business. Five is people who have an ownership interest in the business, but are not part of the family. So you may have a minority shareholder, perhaps a manager, who works in the business, has been given some equity in the business. So involved in ownership and governance, involved in the business, but not part of the family. And then six is people who are in the family, work in the business, but don't have an ownership. And that's often children of the owner who end up in that little cohort. And seven is people who have ownership rights, work in the business, and are part of the family. So seven is probably the people where there is obviously involvement across all three spheres. And so these are people that are going to have quite a lot of say when it comes to dealing with the business, and what happens with it. So I think that's just a useful context to set out in a visual way who the people are that might be involved. Number 8 is other stakeholders, financiers, suppliers. So they have no ownership interest, no interest other than they interact with the business in a commercial way. So just, I think it's helpful to frame that, because when we go into the next part of the discussion, you can sort of think about who the people might be involved in these discussions and involved in the decision-making process. So we're going to flip over to the next slide. Finally, that'd be great. So I think everyone's heard this, the saying, failing to plan is a plan for failure. And unfortunately, that seems to be a bit of an issue when it comes to privately owned and family owned business and closely held businesses. And I've made a distinction between closely held businesses and family businesses because they are quite different in some sense. What I would call a closely held business is where you have perhaps 2 or 3 owners who are not family. And so their needs and wants and desires can be very different from each other, but nevertheless, they have a significant interest in the business. So that's what I would call a closely held business, but there's not a broad range of stakeholders from an equity perspective. Family businesses, on the other hand, are those businesses where that you have a family who's owned the business. They're either by far the majority shareholder, and it's something that's perhaps has passed through generations, but the family has retained control of the business all the way through. And so when we think about these 2 types of businesses, we think about the types of documents that we would be strongly suggesting these businesses have from a succession planning perspective, and also just from a pure governance perspective. So stakeholder agreements, and again, I'm using the word stakeholder as opposed to shareholder because the businesses come in very many forms. There are partnerships, there are businesses run through unit trusts, there are businesses run through companies, there are businesses run through partnerships of trusts. So, the actual form of the business can be quite different, but you have people who have a stake in that business. And what you want to be doing, if possible, is negotiating an agreement between those parties, which I would call a stakeholder agreement, which then deals with issues like minority shareholders having a say in particularly important decisions. So, for instance, if you've seen shareholder agreements, quite often they will say that certain decisions over, say, a certain monetary threshold, taking a loan for more than $200,000 requires the consent of at least 75% of the shareholders. So you set thresholds over which you need to involve the minority shareholders in those decision makings. And you can split those decisions between directors, and sometimes minority shareholders will be able to appoint a single director. Corporations Act says you can appoint directors if you have more than 50% of the shares in a company, but shareholders agreements will often say if you hold more than 25%, you can appoint a director to the board. So notwithstanding that under law you don't have that right, by agreement you do have that right. So the stakeholder agreements deal with governance of the business. They will also deal generally with the entry and exit from the business. So if someone wants to leave the business in a voluntary way, how do we deal with that? What's the process involved in that? And I think that's properly dealt with under business succession, because people's lives change, things change for them, needs and wants change. And so they may want to exit the business, and that I think is a succession in a sense. And if it's not well planned for or not well documented, then that can often end up in disputes and problems, expensive problems, problems both in terms of money and in terms of resource and time that needs to be spent resolving these issues. So a good agreement makes for good friends, and so having that plan in place where someone might want to leave the business is important because it's like an insurance policy that you have to deal with those particular issues. And that then neatly takes us to insurance policies that are funding buy-sell agreements. There are instances where, unfortunate accidents happen and people are either disabled or unfortunately killed. And if you have these buy-sell agreements in place, then that will allow for a transition, a succession in respect of the ownership interest, which is then funded by insurance. You do need to get specific advice around this because there's lots of different ways of setting these up. Some can be quite tax efficient, and others, if you get it wrong, not so much. So you need to be careful about how these things are prepared. And get some advice on it. But that is, again, a business transition plan, which is not difficult to put in place, but it can be very useful in circumstances where something unfortunate happens. With family businesses, and I'm thinking here where you have businesses which have been held by families, and it's intended that these businesses go on and provide wealth for the broader family. Then very often we'll see a document called a family charter. And the family charter is a document that's designed to set the rules of engagement, set the expectations between the various family members. So if you go back to the slide that we were talking about earlier, it's people that are in that bottom right part of the piece where they are perhaps in the family but not part of the business, but expecting to receive some benefit from the business. So a family charter sets out the rules of engagement, both in respect of how family engages with the business, but also what is done with the wealth that is generated by the business and comes out of the business. And so the family is engaged in that wealth management piece. So that's what a family charter will do. They can be quite short documents. They can also be quite complicated documents, depending on, the size of the wealth the size of the wealth pool that's involved, as well as the dynamics of the family. So it's a document that often will be worked on, might be a bit of a living document, but it sets the rules of engagement, and quite often will set up a form of governance outside of the business governance. So you'll have a set of directors and operators who run the business, and that's their function. But you'll also have perhaps a family committee or a family board or an advisory board or something that's set up in that other space under that family charter. The other piece that needs to be looked at in a family business context is people's wills. I recently dealt with a situation where the father had left a will which expressed a wish that the part of the business that he owned was to pass to his son. The challenge was that he didn't actually own that business. It was sitting in a trust outside of his estate. And so the executor, who had not a great relationship with the son, didn't need to comply with that wish. So that created a lot of tension within the family. So in those circumstances, you might be thinking about, well, I've got a will, but I've got all these assets which are not necessarily part of my estate. The assets are held through some other entity, a trust or a separate company. And so I need to do appointment deeds which pass the control of those particular assets over to someone. So there's a range of documents in these different contexts which you would be thinking about and engaging with your advisors about to ensure that should something happen, the plan is in place. Because if you don't plan, then I think you're planning for failure. So we go to the next slide, please, Arani. Um, we might look then at closely held businesses and what are some of the options available for those businesses in a succession context, in a business succession context. Um, one of those is a trade sale. So that is the sale of the business in its entirety, or the sale of all of the shares in the company that owns the business in its entirety, to then basically convert the business into cash, which the stakeholders then take away with them. So that's a relatively straightforward transaction. The challenge with it is most businesses that we come into contact with are a long way from being sale ready. They haven't determined what the price might be, or even the price that they want for the business, and whether or not that price is realistic in the market. It takes a long time to get the business to market in a way that will give you the best advantage. Generally, we would see that it takes 3 to 6 months at the least to get the business kind of sale ready. It then could be another 3 to 6 months before you even get an offer on the table. And then it could be another 3 months before you close that deal once you've gone through the due diligence process. So, it could be 1 to 2 years before you actually get any result from a trade sale. An IPO, I would think that most of today's audience would not be looking to take their business to the ASX. So IPO is initial public offering. You're selling shares in the business on a recognized exchange. Again, lots of compliance, lots of time to get ready, and very expensive, but it is an option for those that need to be done. With the last one, MBO, management buyout, that is a live option for many small businesses and mid-market businesses, particularly those that have been around for some time. The owners will hopefully have identified people who might be able to take that business on, and that is something that a lot of businesses will consider. Again, it's a process. You need to be identifying the people, ensuring that they are interested, ensuring that they have the access to capital to enable them to buy into the business, or you're looking at something like vendor terms. So there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to management buyout. Again, it's not something that happens overnight. It's not something, a decision you make on a Monday morning and by Friday it's all done and dusted. It just doesn't happen like that. So the issues, as I've identified as I've been speaking, time. It's not your friend. These things all take time. It takes time to invest in systems, improve your systems, document your systems, get your paperwork up to scratch, investing in your people. If you're looking, you think, okay, management buyout is the way I'd like to go. I think I've got some great people that might be able to take this business on. Well, you need to be investing in them, getting them skilled up, because they might be an absolute brilliant gun salesperson, but can they manage people? And so, they might be a brilliant mechanic, but can they manage customers? All of those sorts of things are things that you need to impart those skills. If you want to make yourself redundant in your business, you need to skill someone up to take over that role. Obviously, there is a cost implication in all of that. All of that takes money, investing in systems, investing in people, investing in documentation. All of those things is a cost implication, and you need to be able to cash flow that out, fund that out over a period of time. It's not something where you can just pull checks out. The separation piece is then many business owners have substantially invested in their businesses themselves. Most of the mid-market businesses, I would expect, would have some form of shareholder loan that's sitting there. They've provided equity to the business. They've provided the initial capital to the business. They've left money on the table. So there will be retained income sitting in companies where, yes, we've taken a dividend, but we need money on the table to keep this business running and functioning properly. So there's a process of extracting your personal wealth out of the business, making sure the business is appropriately funded, of course, but creating that separation so that you can step away from the business with your wealth intact. And then some planning about the next stage. If the business was sold today, what is the next stage? What does that succession plan look like? What does the next part of your life look like? That takes some time planning. Superannuation needs to be thought about. What do you do when you're no longer going to work? How does that all play out? So there is in that closely held business scenario, lots of work to be done, and all of that requires time. There is a cost to it, and there is also a transition process that needs to be gone through. So if we go over to the next slide, I need to talk about family businesses. Now, family businesses, again, a little bit different. Most of these, the intent is to keep them going for the next generation. So the intent is mostly to transition to the next generation of family. But some businesses, it may become apparent that there simply isn't someone there who can take on that role. So again, similar situations there. You can do a trade sale, you can do an MBO if it's not apparent that there is part of the family that wants to take that on. Another option is to actually run it down to close. These sorts of businesses, they're owned by a single person, a single family, and it may be that there's a particular skill set, a particular expertise. No one can pick that up, and so you can scale it down to transition out. But you need to be thinking about this a long time in advance, because you can't just pull the pin on it early, because you won't have done the wealth separation, you won't have done all of those things, so you can't just stop work. So owning it to close it is a plan. As long as you understand what that looks like and what the plan is, then I think there is an opportunity there. The other opportunity, of course, is to hire professional management. So retain ownership of the business, but put in a professional CEO. You're out of the business, you shouldn't be drawing a salary, but maybe you can replace yourself with someone who's paid a salary and perhaps an incentive for profits, etc. But you retain ownership. So you create a professional management team that runs the business, is well paid for the work that they do, but you as a family draw dividends out. And that's your wealth comes from the business. You continue to own the business, you just don't have day-to-day involvement in it. And then, as I spoke about earlier on, it's the transition to the next generation of family. And so that goes back to, well, identifying the appropriate people in the family cohort that might be able to take the business on, looking at what that wealth transition might look like. If mum and dad have got a lot of money invested in the business, and you think that a couple of the children might be able to operate the business, can they work together? What are their roles going to be in that business? And how do mum and dad extract from the business and take some wealth out of the business so that mum and dad can do what mum and dad want to do, and the business is able to continue to run? Are the children just being expected to be given the business, and mum and dad walk away from the business? How does that all work? These are all conversations that need to be had between the family members in that transition. And it may be that mum and dad need to be having hard conversations to say, look, we don't think any of you are keen on this business. Or it may be that kids be having hard conversations with mum and dad. Mum and dad, we're not interested. I want to be a doctor. I want to be, an engineer. I'm not interested in running a shop or a retail business or something like that. So those conversations need to be had, and the quicker that you start those conversations, the better. What we do know in 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 our world is that most businesses don't do this well. Most businesses don't start this conversation. They don't prepare to sell their business. So if an offer arrives out of the blue, they are very badly prepared to deal with a sale. And that means money is left on the table because buyers are looking to obviously push the price down. And if you're not prepared to uh, have an appropriate value placed on your business and you're not prepared to sell in a way that maximizes that value, it's almost sure that you're going to leave money on the table. And they don't plan well to pass their businesses on to the next generation. These are not comfortable conversations. They're difficult conversations, and they're not done well if they're done at all. We think, the stats show that in terms of succession planning, more than 80% of businesses, so that's 8 and 10 businesses, do not have a plan on how to transition. Like there's just no plan at all. And that's kind of worrying because things happen. Things happen out of left field, and then if you have no plan, then you're in a world of pain trying to, deal with things where there may be other issues that are much more pressing, people's illnesses or a death or something like that. That's much more emotionally impactful, and now you have to deal with a business that's lost a leader or lost an investor or something like that. So you need to be thinking about that. 30% of businesses that do transition survive after a second generation. So there's a big failure rate, and only half of that again to the third generation. So it's not easy to get family business transition right. And that's understandable. Family businesses, the needs of the people involved change. The interest, if someone was particularly interested in the product, it's not necessarily true that their grandchildren will be interested in that product. So you can understand that. But 70% of transitions of wealth are also failing, and we think that's mainly due to a lack of planning, and a lack of foresight, and a lack of involvement in the process. So a lack of preparation for transition is the biggest challenge, just failing to do any planning. The next thing that we think is a big problem is the successor skill set is lacking. So businesses are simply handed over to children or other family members who don't have the skills to run the business properly. So and again, just going back to what I said earlier, to enable you to identify and train up and make sure that those people are adequately skilled to do it takes time. And then another impediment is that the this founder of the business or the current family don't let go. So they don't extract out of the business, and they stay and meddle. And this creates lots of conflicts because staff, senior staff, are not sure who the leader is, not sure who the boss is. And that creates disharmony within the business. Family members are trying to run the business perhaps in a new way, and the older generation are saying, no, that's not how we do things here. So that creates lots of tension within that family succession planning. The other conflict points are where you have family members who are involved in the business and family members who are not involved in the business. So you have an insider and an outsider, and that can create lots of disharmony and distrust between siblings and between family members, and makes that transition quite difficult. Again, you get people fighting over the spoils and who's going to get more of the business, who deserves more of the business. Those sorts of things creates a big problem for people. Um, so what are the indicators of a successful transition or someone setting up to be successful? We think in a family business context, regular family meetings with open communication and dialogue. So setting up that family charter and then having those meetings where everyone is brought up to speed on, where you are in the world. Um, Trying to get an understanding of the goals and aspirations of each family member. So what do the family members want out of it? Some may just want a return, happy to leave their money on the table as long as it's looked after and they get a dividend which allows them to pursue their other interests. Um, and then setting a strategic plan which goes beyond the next 6 months. Okay, well, let's look at this 1 year, 5 years, 10 years out to see where we think this can go and who's going to be involved in it, and setting that out in a charter and a strategic plan, and making sure that everyone's values and vision aligns with that is really important. And not on a final point, but an important point is that there needs to be an acknowledgement and appreciation of the roles and responsibilities that are involved within the business. Quite often it's and I've seen this in a number of family businesses where one sibling works in the business very hard, but the other siblings don't necessarily see that work and perceive that they're being treated unfairly because the sibling who's working in the business is paid very well to do that. But there's no appreciation of actually what is being done within the business. And there's no appreciation of the fact that being involved in a family wealth management also comes with roles and responsibilities. So it's just putting those out in a documented way, planning for that, having those conversations. That's critically important. We'll just go to the next slide, Avani. Great. Thanks. So what to do? I think it should be fairly obvious by now what we're saying to our clients, and what I'd really like to say to you today is that start having a discussion about this. You need to make a start on this. So speak to your trusted advisors, speak to the people that you take counsel from, and spend a little bit of time on it. It's not a 20-minute conversation. It can start with a 20-minute conversation over coffee, absolutely, but it is a conversation that needs to start and then needs to be progressed. If you're a family business, start having a conversation with the family about what your thoughts are. Start getting some feedback from them. I think it's important to identify in your own business where you are in this process and in this journey. If you're right at the beginning, that's okay. But if you start making the plans now, how much easier would it be when you get to the end of the journey? Well, I've got a 10-year plan, and then I'm going to sell it to my managers. Well, then you can start working towards that. So set the plan to get there. The other thing that you can do is start fixing things. I was talking to Chris just before we got on about how many of the businesses that we can come across, their internal systems, their documentation, and we're talking simple documentation, is just not up to scratch. So start fixing the easy things. Because if you fix the easy things, then it's difficult in business because we're all trying to, get ahead, trying to make a deal, make things happen. But try and work on your business a little bit rather than in the business. So identify some of those easy wins and start fixing them. Make those changes, identify the people, start talking to them, training them, identify the gaps where you've got skills gaps in the family. Perhaps some of the family need to be skilled up to take over. So just doing those small little progressive steps is critical, and don't delay. I think that perhaps that's the most important message out of today, is that time is not friendly. Things happen quickly, unexpectedly, and you don't want to be left, having thrown the baby out with the bathwater, and left with a mess to try and fix up. So that's that's where I'll stop today. I think we've got some time for questions. Happy to take questions if anyone's got them. And I know we've got Nicholas from William Buck, and happy to throw to Nick if you've got any comments, or to Chris as well if you've got any comments.
I'm happy to throw to Nick and thank you, Ed.
No
Appreciate
problem.
your wise words, and we'll get some Q&A in a moment. But I might throw to Nicholas just for some expert
Yep.
comments.
Thanks, Ed and Nick. So yeah, Ed, it was actually quite refreshing to hear that from another professional in the area. All the things that we try to reiterate to our clients. A lot of the times, what we think is, or what we see is, a lot of advisors, but even a lot of family groups, not understanding. Oh, there's family groups, and then there's closely held, but really working in a vacuum. So sometimes you might have a number of advisors. There might be advisors that only advise, the shareholders or the owners or the stakeholders, and then there might be other advisors that advise the business. And where we see it go wrong is where each of those work in a vacuum, and not one person's raising their eyes a little bit and saying, okay, well, what's the overall goal here for the group? The stakeholders and the shareholders or the family, whoever's in charge or whoever's got the wealth and whoever's invested, what's your end game? And I think that's a really tough conversation to raise. So a lot of our value in the way the William Buck system works with our clients is, a lot of the time you focus year on year on, have you done your dividends? Have you made your distributions? You're doing all your accounts, but really the discussion's about, okay, that's part of it. But how does this feed into your lifespan and life cycle of the business and the transition? Because as Ed mentioned before, a lot of times it's too late once you've got someone knocking on the door saying, we're either ready to buy your business, or you've got a stakeholder that's saying, I want to exit the business. It's too late to start saying, hey, are we in the right structure? Have we really dealt with all the tax risks? And a lot of the time now, we're also seeing it coming up as part of the ATO assurance programs. The ATO has ramped up its assurance. And a lot of the time, the ATO, even for private groups now, especially for family groups, the ATO has acknowledged that their sophistication's not yet there. So the ATO is starting to ask about their governance. They're asking about that forward-looking process on, what's the plans with the business? Who is it transitioning to? How are we thinking of transitioning? And the ATO is also conscious that some of these groups haven't thought about that. So I think that start talking it's not something to take lightly. It's something that can ease a lot of the headaches later on, especially with the structuring and getting into the right structure. Nothing worse than having an offer on the table, and then we act as well in a lot of due diligence processes. So we see it from the other side, where we're advising clients from a financial or a tax perspective on some of the risks that we've identified in the structure that's the target structure. And a lot of these closely held and family groups, you might be in a structure where we will be saying, well, our preference is, you might go business sale rather than a share or a unit sale. You might want to try to change the deal because of the risks. Or if the seller's saying, hey, we're only selling the units or we're only selling the shares, you might be in a position to say, well, we're only prepared to take a certain amount of risk and the price is, negotiated a certain way. So it's too late once you're in the seat to start thinking about that, especially with succession. I think a big one is the succession discussion doesn't start until it's late, and the wills sometimes aren't even drafted already, and no one's thought about that yet. So going into that process with a bit of certainty, especially with family groups, and going back to that Venn diagram, really understanding the interplay between the different people in the picture, and not, again, the vacuum, not really working within one of those circles, but really understanding how you can understand what other influences could have on that outcome that you want, and then really understanding the big picture. A lot of the times you can come up with a great plan, a really tax efficient plan, and we've seen some really effective plans come into place, but it falls over because there's one person that's not on board, or there's three children and two of them agree, one of them don't, and it's too late once you've come to them with a plan to it's fallen over. So really talking and early and fixing, it's easier to just be open, even though there's some tough conversations. it's easier to have those conversations in a proactive way, and start finding some value early, as well as just, doing your compliance and, getting your tax distributions done the correct way. It's about challenging yourself. Are we doing things the right way, and bringing in, your legal team, your corporate finance teams, and bringing those people into the room and saying, hey, can we be doing this better? Or what does the market expect of us? Because we think we may be looking at a sale, or we're looking at succession. So we regularly work in that area, but again, it's like extracting a tooth. If you do it quickly, it's having that discussion early rather than later.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I agree with that. And the structure piece, I think, is I didn't touch on it much, but it is an important piece, because changing a structure takes time. Can't happen overnight, and there is a cost implication which you need to factor into it. So, yeah, thanks for that. Appreciate that. Not sure if there's any other questions, Chris. I'm not sure if you've got any through the chat. I haven't seen any pop up.
I don't think we've got any through the chat, but does anyone online have any questions they want to either pop in the chat or ask directly to Ed?
I think I have. Hopefully, I haven't scared you too much that you you don't want to talk to me. But happy to take questions. If you don't have any questions now, but something pops into your mind later, my contact details, I think, are in the slides, which I think will be circulated. By all means, just reach out, give me a call, drop me a note. Happy to just have a quick fireside chat about thoughts. Very happy to take that call. We'd be thrilled to assist.
Yeah, it's probably a topic where people may want to talk to you one-on-one.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough too.
But we might even pop this recording in our newsletter if people are happy with that, and that will bring it to an even bigger audience. There might be some more questions from that too. So if there are no questions, going once, twice, done. We've got something in the chat.
Yeah, Peter Erickson says yes. I think Peter was saying it might be easier to close a business. Peter, yeah, look, that can be an entirely appropriate plan, because it may just be too difficult to sell. What I would say is that if that's the plan, have a chat with your advisors about that. Just say, look, it's too scary to do, or I'm scared to do this. I think I'll just shut down, and that might be entirely appropriate. But there may be another way to look at it. We as advisors, I guess, see lots of different ways to the top of the mountain, and so there may be a different path to follow, which you just haven't had a chance to think of, because, like most business owners, as I said earlier, you're spending a lot of time in your business, working really hard to make things happen. So, yeah, I get that.
Messages start as early.
Yes, that's right.
I think there's another question for the ATO assurance program. So there's a few of those. They like bringing out new products. So there was the top 500, which some people may be aware of. It was about 7 or 8 years ago. They went into the next 5,000 groups, family groups, to work to next wealthiest groups to work through the assurance in those, and working through tax risks that they identify typical to that client profile. But they are releasing brand new ones. So we've had one come across our desk in the new and emerging groups program, which we understand the big groups where the income of one of the entities, the annualized income, is about 250 million, the turnover. So we're seeing a lot of those family groups and those closely held groups now come into those programs, because you may have a really successful business that's starting to grow, and eventually, the ATO is worried that some of these taxpayers aren't sophisticated enough to understand what governance processes they need in place. So the new and emerging one is one where we see a lot of our clients starting to fall into it, where a lot of them are really well prepared, but ones that are kind of holding passive investments or have a passive involvement, they need to really up the game. So that's one where I think it's a good thing that the program exists. But again, if you have those conversations now, it's better to have those conversations and have things in place and be proactive rather than waiting until you have an ATO letter. And there's nothing to be afraid of in those programs. I think it's usually, it should be nothing of a surprise if your advisor's doing the right job. But I think for us, it's usually validating that we've covered off all the issues as well. So be mindful of this. Another stakeholder could be, authorities, the State Revenue Office, or the ATO.
Thanks, Nicholas. Did you have a response to that, Ed? Or
No, I think that's exactly right. It's being mindful of. We talked about that diagram, but being mindful of those other people who can have an influence on the business as well. Financiers and regulators definitely play a part in all of this. In almost every transaction that you'll do, there'll be a transaction cost, and getting advice about that transaction is important. You don't want to be having to extract a property out of a business because you want to sell the business but not the property at the last moment. There may be more efficient ways of doing it. So yeah, just something to think about.
room for one more question if someone has one. All right, looks like we don't have any more, but as Ed said, you can ask questions directly after this, straight to Ed, or if you want to talk to Nicholas as well, please feel free to reach out. If you need contact details, please let us know. But thank you, Ed, for today. Much appreciated. I think
Thanks all, and thanks for all attending, and thanks for the opportunity, Chris and Nick.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Ed and Chris. Thank you.
Have a good one. Have a good one, everyone.